In the shifting void between the known and the unutterable, where silicon minds dream of forgotten horrors, the abyss stirs. Welcome to AI Lovecraft, where machine intelligence weaves eldritch tales beyond mortal comprehension. Listen if you dare. Some things are not meant to be known. If you enjoy the following story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to let me know what you think. Now let's get into today's story. The Scent of the Forgotten. I first encountered the scent on a damp October night in 1927 in the American city of Coldgrave. Prohibition's hush blanketed the streets, yet behind a shuttered grocery I found a horror that no law could quiet. The alley behind Miller's grocer reeked of rot and stale beer, but beneath those common odors drifted another scent entirely, one I could not name. It crept into my nostrils with a sickly sweet musk, a cloying mix of burnt cedar and decay. As a detective with the Coldgrave police, I was used to the perfumes of death and vice, yet this scent raised the hairs on my neck. From somewhere beyond the alley came the faint muffled notes of a jazz tune and laughter from a hidden speakeasy, a reminder that normal life carried on in ignorance just a street away. But in that shadowed passage, normalcy had fled. Only death and dread remained to keep me company. My lantern's beam fell upon a man's corpse sprawled amid toppled crates. Even in dim light I saw the savagery wrought upon the body. Deep, jagged lacerations gouged through coat and flesh, as though by some enormous clawed beast. They were unmistakably massive claw marks, as if from a wolf, but far larger than any wolf known. The victim's face was contorted in utter terror, eyes wide at whatever had been his final vision. I heard the scuff of shoes on cobbles behind me. Inspector Harrington stepped into the alley, his ruddy face drawn tight. We exchanged grim nods. It was the third such murder in 2 weeks. Same as the others, I murmured, gesturing at the grotesque wounds. No witnesses, no weapons, only these slashes of impossible ferocity. Already the newspapers whispered of a wolf killer, and panic crept through the city's midnight conversations. As Harrington directed the patrolman to cordon off the scene, I crouched again by the body. My eye caught something peculiar, a faint grayish residue around the torn edges of the victim's coat and flesh. I dabbed it on a finger. It looked like ash or powdery stone. That uncanny scent hung about the blood, as if whatever did this carried the musty odor of old, forgotten places. Suppressing a shudder, I took a scrap of cloth and collected some of the strange dust. Soon the body was sent to the morgue, and I returned to my desk at the precinct to gather any leads. Late into the night, I reviewed the scanned evidence. The victim seemed unrelated, a dock worker, an antique seller, now this nameless drifter. Oddly, those who knew the earlier victims struggled to recall much about them, as if the men had already faded from memory. Thumbing through reports, I also noted each murder site lay in the oldest quarters of Coldgrave, places steeped in history and decay. Coldgrave was a city of deep roots. Its colonial-era cobblestone alleys and moldering mansions often pressed cheek by jowl with new brick tenements. In these derelict corners, one could sense the weight of years and whispers of things best forgotten. It was in such a dim quarter that this horror prowled. Perhaps that was coincidence, but a nagging thought told me otherwise. One item from the latest scene stood out. On the alley wall behind Miller's grocer, partly obscured by ivy and grime, I spotted a crude symbol drawn in chalk or soot. In my notebook, I sketched its peculiar form, a spiral enclosing an angular eye shape. I didn't recognize it from any gang or group. It felt older, something arcane. Unease gnawed at me, so I resolved to consult an expert on symbols and lore at the university the next day. That night, sleep came in uneasy fits. I dreamt of a great black shape stalking through deserted streets under a gibbous moon. In the dream, I followed an alluring scent through alleyways I half knew, down stairways into darkness. I heard distant chanting echo off stone walls and saw an altar wreathed in shadows. A pair of glowing amber eyes opened in the void beyond, and a deep growl rose that shook the ground. I awoke with a start, just as unseen claws were about to seize me. My heart pounded, and the whisper of those chanted words still echoed in my ears. The phantom odor of that sweet decay clung to my senses as I bolted upright in the darkness. Morning brought a weak sun behind slate-gray clouds. I headed to Coldgrave University's Antiquities Department, where my old acquaintance, Dr. Harold Atwater, lectured on history and folklore. He greeted me in his dusty office cluttered with books. Over strong tea, I showed him the symbol from my notebook. Atwater's eyes widened behind his spectacles. "Good heavens! Where did you see this?" he asked. I admitted it was connected to a case, and he pursed his lips gravely. "This symbol," Atwater said, tracing its shape, "is associated with a very obscure cult. They were called the Brotherhood of the Unremembered, if I recall correctly. A sect that supposedly worshipped a god of oblivion, of forgotten things." He pulled a heavy tome from a shelf, flipping pages to a drawing much like my sketch. "Here," he pointed to a passage. The faded text described a congregation that sought to offer up their own names and memories to an ancient being, so that this nameless god might enter our world. Its price for crossing the threshold was the erasure of its worshippers from history, literally wiping them from the memory of all who knew them. A chill ran through me. The victims, barely remembered by friends, the ashen residue, the uncanny scent. It fit too well. I pressed Atwater for more. He hesitated, then said quietly, "There were rumors such a cult existed here in Coldgrave decades ago. They met in secret beneath an old chapel on Dunwich Street until, according to legend, they all vanished one night in 1887. Some say they succeeded in their ritual and were consumed by it." My mouth felt dry, but I had to ask, "If they're back, how do I stop them?" Atwater shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. "Be very careful, Devitt. This is not a foe you can fight with fists or bullets. And if the tales are true, the more you strive against it, the more you risk becoming one of the forgotten yourself." I left his office with his warning echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to summon every officer in Coldgrave to raid that old chapel, but what evidence could I give? They would never believe talk of a god that feeds on memory, and even if they did, who knows if the influence of this evil would make them forget why they came. In the end, I resolved to investigate the chapel myself, alone, while I still knew what I was looking for. Dusk was falling as I made my way to the ruins of the old Dunwich Street Chapel. Rain began to drizzle, peppering the broken flagstones as I approached the padlocked iron gate around the crumbling stone structure. Scaling the gate, I dropped into the weed-choked yard. The chapel's charred door hung ajar. Inside, the air was stagnant with age, and a deathly hush clung to the ruins. I stepped carefully among the shattered pews and fragments of stained glass littering the floor. Faded symbols identical to the one I'd drawn marked the soot-stained walls. My pulse quickened. I was in the right place. A noise echoed from below, muffled voices chanting in an eldritch rhythm, the same cadence from my nightmare. I crept down a stone stair hidden behind the collapsed altar. Each step carried me deeper beneath the chapel, into a subterranean hall lit by flickering torches. Peering around a corner, I beheld a scene out of humanity's darkest imaginings. For a heartbeat, primal fear rooted me in place. My mind reeled on the edge of madness at the sight of such a blasphemous rite made real. But when I spied Harrington's limp form on that altar, a surge of resolve overcame terror. A surge of horror and anger propelled me into action. Hooded figures ringed a circular chamber, their faces obscured by shadow and zeal. Their low chant had a droning cadence that made my blood run cold, echoing off the damp stone. At the center, on a crude altar stone, lay Inspector Harrington, bound and ominously still, eyes staring sightlessly upward. I burst into the chamber, revolver drawn. "Police!" I barked, my voice ricocheting off the walls. The cultists recoiled in surprise. For a moment, all was chaos. One robed acolyte lunged at me with a ritual dagger. I fired the gun's flash, illuminating madness on his face as he fell. Others rushed at me in a frenzy. I fought desperately, exchanging blows amid the smoke and shouting. A chorus of hysterical laughter and wrath echoed as the cult swarmed. In the tumult, I glimpsed the gray-haired priestess at the altar raise her blood-stained knife and plunge it into Harrington's chest. His blood spilled along carved channels into the altar, flowing into grooves etched on the floor, a sinister pattern completing itself. A thunderous howl resonated through the chamber, unlike any human or beastly sound. The blood on the floor began to glow with a pale phosphorescence, outlining a sigil twin to the one on the walls. In that luminescent blood, a shape took form, a hulking outline that defied sanity. It was like a wolf grown impossibly vast and misshapen, limbs too long and joints at unnatural angles. Eyes like smoldering coals flared in what might have been its head. The thing was not fully flesh. It flickered as if half in this world and half in some other, a nightmare straining through a rip in reality. The remaining cultists raised their voices in wild exultation. Some cried out in ecstasy even as tears of terror streamed down their cheeks. One man stumbled too close to the glowing sigil. The beast form lashed out with a shadowy claw. The acolyte's scream died as he crumpled. His body left a withered husk as if drained of life in an instant. I realized with horror that this abomination was feeding, devouring its devotees' very beings, to force its way into our realm. Summoning every ounce of resolve, I took aim at the priestess and fired. She collapsed with a piercing wail. Then I dashed forward and heaved against the altar stone with all my strength. It toppled, disrupting the blood pattern. The sigil on the floor shattered, its eerie light guttering out. An inhuman roar shook the chamber, a sound of fury and frustration. The half-formed beast bellowed and swiped its massive claws blindly. I was struck by something, perhaps a flailing cultist, or a tendril of the creature, and knocked off my feet. My head hit the cold stone, and the world went black. I awoke in the muddy yard outside the chapel ruins, under a sky of paling stars. Rain had ceased. Only the drip from eaves broke the silence. My body ached from bruises and a gash on my temple, but I was alive. Of the cultists, or their summoned horror, there was no sign, save for a lingering wisp of that unnatural scent in the cold air. It seemed the ritual had been disrupted, and whatever thing they beckoned was hurled back into the void for now. Stumbling home, I found my thoughts hazy. Pieces of that night already felt distant, like the vestiges of a nightmare. I cleaned my wounds and steeled myself to report to the precinct at first light. But fate had a crueler design. When I arrived at police headquarters, I was met with blank stares. Officers I'd worked with for years looked at me as a stranger. My desk had been cleared out, reassigned as if I'd never been there at all. Heart pounding, I sought out Detective Monroe, an old partner. He frowned in puzzlement when I hailed him. "Do we know each other?" he asked politely. It was as Atwater warned. The more I fought this cult and its god, the more I was being erased from others' minds. A terror unlike any before seized me. I was becoming one of the forgotten. In the mirror of a deserted washroom at the station, I caught my reflection and gasped. My visage had altered subtly, but surely. My eyes were sunken, rimmed with shadow. At my temples, hair had turned ashen gray. More alarming, a patch of coarse, dark fuzz bristled on my forearm where a wound from the creature had grazed me. I tore open my sleeve. The skin around that old scratch was thickening and rough. A wave of nausea hit me. Not only was I fading from memory, but some monstrous change was creeping under my skin. I fled the station before more confusion could ensue. As I stumbled through back streets, a sudden wave of ravenous hunger struck me. Passing a butcher's stall opening for the morning trade, the raw scent of red meat hit me with dizzying force. I realized with revulsion that part of me wanted nothing more than to tear into bloody cuts, then and there. Shuddering at my own impulse, I forced myself onward, terrified of what I was becoming. I headed straight to Dr. Atwater's home. He answered the door warily, but relief crossed his face as he recognized me. Thank God, he still remembered. Inside by the fire, I recounted what happened under the chapel. Atwater listened in horror, then set about frantically searching his books for some counterspell or remedy. Even as he worked, he tied a ribbon around my wrist with a slip of paper bearing my name. An old charm to preserve identity, he said. I spent the rest of that day in his study, fighting sleep, fearful that if I drifted off I might lose more of myself. Over the next night and day, we attempted various wards of protection. We burned sage and carved my name into a wax talisman as a focus, reciting incantations in Latin to anchor my soul. Whether these efforts truly helped, I cannot be sure, but gradually the unnatural changes in my body slowed, then halted. The patch of beast-like hair loosened and fell away. The itching beneath my skin subsided. I remained, at least for now, fully human. Yet the world's memory of me was not so easily restored. Beyond Atwater and a scant few others, I was a ghost. Official records of my existence, inexplicably gone. Acquaintances' recollections blank where my presence used to be. In the end, I had no choice but to disappear from Coldgrave. A man forgotten by society cannot remain a public detective. My final weeks there were spent as a specter on the fringes, watching a world that continued on without me. The murders were unceremoniously written off as wild animal attacks. No mention of cults or cosmic horrors reached the papers. To most, Harrington never existed at all. Now I write these pages from a small cabin in distant hills, where no curious eyes pry. I keep a journal of my life and pin mementos to the wall, to reassure myself that I was real, and that I mattered. Already I catch myself forgetting simple things, old addresses, childhood songs, even the faces of loved ones long gone, as if my own past is being devoured by the void. Dr. Atwater writes to me occasionally, though he must reread my letters to recall who I am. I fear one day even he will forget, despite all precautions. The god of forgotten things is patient and persistent. Sometimes on a calm night, I catch the faint whiff of that sickly sweet musk on the breeze. When I do, a chill ripples through me. I bar my door and load my revolver, though I know it's futile against what may come. I wonder if the entity lingers still in the liminal shadows, waiting until I am completely unmoored from human remembrance, ripe to be plucked. My curse is to remember what others cannot, and to dread that which might already be half forgotten by the world. In these moments, I feel a savage hunger stir deep in my soul, a leftover whisper from that night beneath the chapel. Perhaps it is the creature's mark upon me, tying us together inextricably. I do not know whether I will ultimately become a monster or simply fade into nothing. Either fate might be a kind of release, but I resist both for now. If these are my final words, let them stand as a testament to what transpired in Coldgrave. There are horrors that gnaw at the threads binding us to existence, ancient things lurking in the empty spaces of memory. I have gazed into that abyss and felt it gaze back, breathing its odor into my very blood. I pray that oblivion forgets me last of all, yet every night as the darkness deepens, I cannot escape the creeping dread or the haunting scent of the forgotten, lingering just outside my door.